implement water and watershed management solutions to increase resilience in the face of climate change and increase water demands. Diana has expertise in restoration ecology and planning, climate adaptation, and management of public money. She participated in the 2022 Water Leaders program for Water Education Colorado. Currently sits on the advisory board for the CSU Center for Collaborative Conservation. She holds an MS in Rangeland Ecosystem Science from CSU and a PhD in Biological Sciences from ULI in Chicago. All right, well, let's welcome Diana. We don't have a presentation.
PowerPoint free.
Yeah. This is going to be a little more interactive. So
yeah. So thank you all for having me here today. My intent is to talk for 10 to 15 minutes and then kind of open up space for discussion on some of the themes. So I want to start with just a quick personal story to introduce myself. I like to tell people that I grew up with a river next to my backyard, which isn't super surprising for someone who leads a sustainable water program. And I want you to pause and just think about what images that brings up for you. And you might imagine a childhood spent playing in the mud, catching fish, or maybe one where my parents were anxious about flooding in the springtime. But none of those images are correct. So I will confess to all of you, I grew up in Los Angeles, and behind our backyard and hidden behind a big, impenetrable fence was the Tujunga Wash, which is a tributary to the Los Angeles River, and it was a concrete flood control channel. It had been turned into a concrete channel after a massive flood in 1938. And so there were no fish, there were no trees, there was no mud. There was sometimes drag, a movie set like drag racing, they would film down in the wash. But I really experienced, growing up, nature turned into concrete. And I think that really influenced kind of my whole career. I focused on ecological restoration in a consulting role for about 20 years. So that's really the science of restoring damaged ecosystems, and now at the Nature Conservancy leading our freshwater strategy. But what I'm excited about today, together with all of you, is to talk about the leadership skills that are necessary for today's water leaders. So you can find the collaborative solutions for water that meet the needs of nature and of people. And that was obviously something that didn't happen in my backyard. But I just want to say, I was, looking in a little bit at previous presentation, it's really hard to talk cheese. But it's nice to be here. So the story that I just told you, part of my personal connection to water, is actually something that I encourage all of you to do and to develop. So what is your personal water story? What are your family or cultural or spiritual or recreational connections to water? And I think that when we share our personal stories, we have this better chance of finding collaborative solutions where we can all be in a better place in the future. So I want to make the case for you today that there are 3 essential mindsets for being a successful water leader. And we need leaders who are focused on collaboration, on equity, and on understanding the realities of climate change in our world. So why collaboration? Barbara Gray, who's the author of the book Collaborating, Finding Common Ground for Multi-Party Problems, describes collaboration in the following way. Collaboration is when people with a stake in a problem join forces, pool information, knock heads, construct alternative solutions, and forge an agreement. And I'll just repeat that again. So when people with a stake in a problem join forces, pool information, knock heads, construct alternative solutions, and forge an agreement. So why do we want to do this? Really because solutions are more successful and more durable when they satisfy the core needs of all the parties involved. When you can design the solutions where all benefit in some way. Depending on the context of your problem, the alternative to collaboration can also be litigation, which I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with. And nobody tends to end up really happy in litigation except the law firms. Who get some nice billings. So what does it mean to join forces? So that means really identifying who should be in the conversation. who does have a stake in the problem. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the equity section too. And what does it mean to pool information? This one is really scary a lot of times. It means being committed to transparency and information sharing. And sometimes, again, depending on the problem, that can mean sharing financial information, and which can, depending on your entities, can be, really kind of scary and difficult to do. And when you are committed to sharing information, that really the tone for that has to come from the leaders. You can't kind of leave it typically to, the engineers or the scientists, but the leaders have to say, yes, like we're willing to share, what we have, what are our processes, where are we going in terms of water. And that's when you can move forward. If you're kind of staying in your camps, holding tightly to your information, it's much harder. So why knock heads? That's kind of my favorite part of the quote. So if you didn't need to knock heads, if everyone was already aligned on the solution, you wouldn't need a collaborative process, like you'd be done. But when you're in this process, what you really don't want in the conversation is for people to be in pretense. And this is a framework that we've been working with in the Nature Conservancy out of a consulting firm called Conversant, and they have some great tools online that they call the conversation leader. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but the idea is that, you can have conversations that don't really get you anywhere, right? So these are sort of slow and inefficient processes. And pretense is like when you're in the lowest part of the conversation meter. And, this is like when you're in a meeting and you sit through the meeting and you leave the meeting and you say to your colleagues, that'll never work. And we've all kind of been in those meetings. So it's where you don't actually speak up about what you're really thinking and feeling in that moment. And if everyone leaves the meeting and then has a side conversation, so like, forget that, then what was the point of that conversation? You just really kind of wasted everyone's time. So if you're knocking heads, and hopefully without giving anyone a concussion, it actually means that you're getting somewhere. So that's a much better thing, again, than those sort of side, eye roll kinds of conversations that don't move us forward. The next part of this framework is on constructing alternative solutions. And this is really about discovering that there are almost always multiple solutions to any problem, and being willing to open your eyes to those multiple solutions. And also for entities to realize that you don't have to have your preferred solution win out as long as the solution is acceptable. So if people are willing to kind of move off of some of their positions, that's, and seeing that there's multiple possibilities, then you can make progress. And then the final part is actually forging the agreement. So finding something that everyone can agree on, even if it wasn't your first choice, memorializing those agreements and commitments, laying out the roles and responsibilities, and really making sure that decision-making leads to implementation. And you probably all experienced that as well, where, you spend a long time in a collaborative process and you think you've come up with, a way forward, and then you get to the implementation phase and everyone kind of goes back to, how they were doing things in the past if you don't really make that leadership commitment to move from the decision-making to the implementation. Okay, so that's my collaboration framework. And just if any of you know the Center for Collaborative Conservation at CSU, in their newsletter this month, that was their banner quote. It's, hey, that's my quote. Maybe it's not my quote, but it's a quote I use all the time. Okay, so equity as our next topic. So there's an old saying, you probably heard it in the West: water flows uphill toward money. And so that's not equity. So if you want to think about what equity is, that's really the opposite of equity. But it's, a lot of reality that, we need to, I think, often fight against. So according to the US Water Alliance, they define water equity as occurring when all communities have access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water and wastewater services, when they're resilient in the face of floods, drought, and other climate risks, when they have a role in the decision-making processes related to water management in their communities, and when they share in the economic, social, and environmental benefits of water systems. So that's hard. That, that is not easy, you know, for those of you kind of involved in water management on the ground. But, you know, if you want to have equity, which I would argue you need to have, you know, at the forefront of your decision making, that's really the North Star for decision makers is, you know, the access, the resilience, the decision-making role, and the sharing in the benefits. So, you know, some simple frameworks for thinking about equity, you know, to ask yourselves, like, who is benefiting from this decision? Who's left out? Who is at the table for the decision-making? Who knew where the table was and had access to that table? And when we think about an equity lens and when you want to kind of analyze impacts, we can do that systematically, depending on your data, you know, by race, by ethnicity, by income level, by age. You know, we can ask ourselves, like, who does have access to clean drinking water, to adequate wastewater treatment? You know, who has water for their farms? And I really think a lot about intergenerational equity. So are we using up non-renewable fossil groundwater sources that won't be available for our children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren? So what are the decisions that we're making, you know, that's prioritizing today at the expense of the future? And, you know, I really like the language of fossil groundwater. You know, when you have these non-renewable, you know, really deep groundwater sources, that's what it is. You know, we have fossil fuels that we're, you know, really trying to transition away from, and we have fossil groundwater. And, you know, we really need to think about, you know, when and why are we using up those fossil groundwater sources. So just as an example, at TNC, we've been particularly working with tribal partners across our organization because, you know, we believe in, and research actually shows that Indigenous peoples are really among the most important leaders for pursuing lasting solutions to conservation and development challenges. So, for example, we have a project with the Hickory Apache Nation in the state of New Mexico, you know, with the nation, with the state of New Mexico, with help, you know, we kind of helped develop a sovereign to sovereign agreement between the tribe and the state. And it resulted in leasing 20,000 acre feet of water that the nation wasn't using, fairly compensating the nation for that water, letting it be released into the San Juan River. And actually, a little piece of it flows back into Southwest Colorado as well, where, you know, it's having a significant benefit for endangered fish in the river. So kind of a nice example of, you know, it was kind of a win-win-win between, you know, the nation being compensated for their water, the fish benefiting, better in-stream flows, you know, along the way. There's some compact compliance, so kind of hit all the high points. Okay, and then talk for a moment about climate change. You know, I've given this talk a couple of times, and you know, to this group, and you know, people have seem to appreciate, I don't know if you will or not, but people seem to appreciate kind of this framework. And I was actually reflecting back that I think when I first gave this talk in 2021. You know, it felt like to really talk about climate change was something a little bit new, and it almost feels now like dated to, you know, it just feels like so much of our present reality that I'm not even sure like this needs to be part of the framework anymore, because I think it's part of what everyone does every day. But, you know, we'll talk about it anyways, and then maybe next year we'll just say, okay, we're all, you know, kind of already there. But you know, to the extent that, you know, you're working with constituencies that may still, you know, be challenged in talking, you know, in kind of a climate change framework. What I would always really like to say, and I think it's helpful, is, you know, you go back to like your mutual fund disclaimers, where it always says past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And that's really what we're dealing with in climate change, is really this climate variability. You know, we have these water records over a long period of time, and our past records are really not necessarily adequate to telling us what we're going to be experiencing into the future. So it's not, you know, just drought, it's, you know, kind of flooding, it's, unseasonal warmth or unseasonal, frosts that can, kind of affect water use. It's really kind of living in this feast or famine situation. There was the reporting in 2021 of the massive mega drought in the southeastern United States, which is now, with these really big water years, again, partly resolved, but like that 22-year drought was the worst drought in 1,200 years, which is like pretty wild to think about, like just how different a world, and again, thinking about that intergenerational equity piece, that us and, our future generations are living in. I think you all feel this very much in northeastern Colorado, like you are not separate from the whole Colorado River Basin conversations and what's happening in the Colorado River Basin, the Trans Mountain diversions, like we're all, really connected here. And, I think it's something probably you all know, it's not necessarily something all of your constituents all know, that, when they're turning on the tap, that's, a decent percentage of that, depending on where you all are and what your water systems are. And I can't really, the print is small and I, don't know where you're all from, but, a lot of that might be Western slope water and people don't realize that. But, you really are the leaders who can move your communities to try to build in resiliency to these impacts, and in moving also, toward a decarbonized future. And that this is the framework that, we at the Nature Conservancy, would love to promote and see as undergirding decision-making in the water space, because we're really, climate change is not something out there in the future. It's, what we're living through all of the time in our present. So before we start to engage in some discussion on these topics, I'd like to leave you with a quote from a former rabbi of mine who was fond of saying, the only way to get it together is together. And I really believe that. So, I'm committed to collaboration. Thank you for being here as water leaders. Okay, so some food for thought. So what my thought on kind of structuring the discussion is, we'll sort of talk about each of those topics. So we'll start with collaboration. And I would love for any of you to share any brief stories you have of collaborations that were critical to moving forward with an initiative, whether that was in the water space or not. What made the collaboration work? Or if you've had ones that fell apart, kind of what was challenging? What would you like your fellow water leaders to learn from with your experiences? And I'd like to take the notes as people talk. Anyone willing to be brave?
Sometimes sharing is caring. Now that's the planner coming out in me, but like we, when you find common ground in terms of whether it be infrastructure or your water sources or whatnot, finding out how to utilize your neighbors and like how your neighbors utilize you for the best particularly possible. We have a cooperative agreement with the city that says we get our mountain water through and they treat it for us, but we've got an IGA from a planning perspective that we've got a kind of a line drawn in the sand, so to speak. One side will be Fort Lupton and one side will be Hudson, but the water service area or the sewer service area may not follow that line. And because we share systems, we're able to do that.
That's great. So what I'm hearing is that, it's actually like the physical reality of sharing systems that lets you have, the conversations that can let you find that common ground, because, you really have the stake in the same problems and solutions. So sometimes it's the physical infrastructure.
It's also the legal systems. So our water sources have to gel well enough to where we're not gonna screw each other on, you're gonna take my water for augmentation if you take our sewer water to your plant, because I need that to go through our plant, kind of deal. But you work that out. And at the end of the day, there's compromises there where if we're gonna be a sewer provider and we're gonna utilize some of Fort Lupton's water for augmentation, maybe we give them a little credit for it. So there's sharing is caring, going back to my.
That's great.
Now you're gonna see me randomly and you're gonna be like, Jennifer, sharing's caring.
That's awesome. Yeah.
She's like a share.
And where you can see that win-win, right? So that you don't, because if you came at it where I can only, I can only make a decision that only in all of its aspects benefits only my constituents, you're not going to find something that actually benefits you more broadly.
Well, and the end user of these utilities are the residents, right? And if they have really jacked up utility rates that are so high they can't pay them, then that doesn't make any sense. So by the sharing, we're kind of able to kind of equalize our utility rates, so we're not having to kind of jerk them up and down as we grow and ebb and flow. So it creates a little stabilization.
That's great. Thank you. Is there anyone else? Next great person?
Actually, two of us are here. So Nick and I are involved with a water authority that just got stood up with 4 entities this last year. So Fort Collins Level Water District, Windsor is also here, sorry.
Yes, fine.
Yeah, so the 3 of us just went through the process of spinning up a water authority to, amongst other things, treat and deliver water potentially down the road to all those entities. So, yeah. It was probably one of the more highly collaborative events. I'm normally used to cutting as many turkeys as I can and run down the hill and get what I can out of it. And this is like a unique way of kind of going at that. So there's a lot of trust in the room. There's also a lot of relationships that we previously had. I've known Jess for years and then for years. We kind of built capital around that and tried to set up some common themes with a unique thing called, there's no net zero sum that was going on. It was like, hey, can I win some and can in the process you win some? And we tried to steer all of our, is that fair, Jess? Or-
Absolutely. Gonna make comment to that one too, Wes, and when you formed it, now the real work starting.
Yeah.
Right,
Very much
like,
so.
it's there, you're a board member of that, and now what's next? And I think that's the exciting part, is how we continue to move that as we change
Yeah.
and make it. Or just on the communications piece, it's been exciting.
So in terms of kind of which is really awesome and exciting.
Yeah.
As a former, brief Fort Collins resident, and a CSU student 10,000 years ago. So previous relationships were really important, that you were starting with trust, where kind of new collaborations, it can be kind of a long process to get to trust. But what else? I mean, it sounds like you kept the attorneys out of the room, or not?
They had their own room.
Okay.
They did really well together, so it's like, sometimes.
Did you have like a really good facilitator? Did you start with this kind of can we all win? Like, what were some of the ingredients that went into your successful collaboration cake?
Why don't you take this?
I think we did have a good facilitator. We brought in a company to help us, that had background and previous knowledge of, creating and running a water treatment plant. So I was able to lead the conversation and actually had that relationship with most all of us prior to as well. That helped out to have that trust in the room already. Yeah.
Right, so not just a sort of generic collaboration facilitator, but someone with, sort of,
Knowledge.
real knowledge of the kind of practicalities of the issues that you're facing.
I felt like that was critical because we could trust each other as we've known all the managers or staff in the room. We all knew each other for a long time, but because this was high stakes, high dollars and long-term implications, we needed a facilitator who could push us and help us deliver information that we collaboratively share. So we're tipping our hand a little bit, here's my 2 aces, I'm not gonna show you everything, but of the 5 cards I've got, here's 4. And it could kind of help us honestly own that, and you kind of bring that to the table to have some conversation around, so, yeah.
Well, I think out of the 4 entities, it's interesting because we all kind of starts upstream and runs downstream, right, to you. And we all have an idea of how we affect each other and respect that as well. And know the places we are in growth, right, compared to the other. And I think understanding those problems outside of that too is important.
Did staff drive that, or did the political leaders fire you to get it? The
Staff.
did.
I had to go sell it repeatedly because the people in the room I trust, like, hey, I've been around this a while and there's not a lot of situations I've seen where I've got a highly collaborative highly trust amongst staff, like, I think I can get a deal here. Like, I wouldn't tell you that if I didn't think I could do that. And yeah, it was not that way.
From my perspective, that's our role as staff, to see those things. That's why we're there, and then bring those options and opportunities forward. And make the collective work too.
You guys came up last night at the Fort Collins council meeting, because one of the questions was, we've got 5 water districts in the Fort Collins area. Has there ever been talk of combining and creating a regional consolidation?
Well, yeah.
Still 5, it's still 5.
Thanks, Jerry. I was going there next.
So by executive decree, we'll do it tomorrow. No, Councilman.
Okay. So what kind of helped you with, selling? Well, I guess I'll ask sort of 2 questions. So one is, you needed enough space, right, as staff, needed enough trust from your leadership to be able to start to have those conversations and collaborations. And then you also needed to, so obviously there had to be enough buy-in to let you start.
Of course, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, you also needed, what helped you sort of sell that up, that, you were going to be better off in a win-win versus a sort of zero sum.
I think I think there's also the ability as a candidate, from my perspective, at least with the boards I talked to, some honest conversation about reality around the situation we had. And so, sometimes it's easy just to gloss over to make the pain go away and kind of anesthetize the situation. But it's like, no, let's just have an honest conversation about what this looks like. And so this is how this can be distinctly different. And this is why we ought to keep investing. And I gotta say, there was a critical moment in the group where I thought I should say fractured, but we could have lost an entity, actually mine, and there was another entity who came to the table and said, no, we're not gonna make this happen. This is too highly collaborative. We are gonna make this thing work. It may not work all of what you need, but we will take that next first tranche at it. And man, you talk about a pivot moment where you just drill down. Because then the value of the group as a whole, the integrity of the group as a whole was actually worth more than any one group. And it was the group that had the most to lose. For water, who made the convince themselves.
I think that's a good point too, Wes. It wasn't all rainbows.
No.
Because you have to look for those things for sure.
Only had, what you said, funny, you had buddy at the beginning.
Yeah,
It was actually productive, it was productive.
that's right.
For Windsor to sell it, to thank our community development director, Dornhill, painting that picture of what the information on the water resources side for us. What does this mean for us? What's the cost if we don't do this with our other treatment providers? And we have to start now. And because of our buy-in to this, we might have to expand somebody else's plan. Why don't we do that here and have that opportunity? And he's a big believer in collaboration when it comes to this water stuff as well.
Good. That's really exciting to hear, but yeah, some of these, sort of acknowledging these pivot moments and seeing them. When you really get to this point where, someone else's success, you're as invested in their success as in your own success.
Correct. Yeah.
That's really when you sort of made that leap to that next level.
I think it's interesting that you brought up that you were like potentially not gonna continue, because this is not water, like. I don't have big conversations with other brewers about water most of the time. But in terms of collaboration, because every kind of agrees, think we need to do right by it. But knowing when either you or when another organization is no longer part of the collaboration and making that decision and making that like a clear cut conversation, instead of dragging something out that's really bringing down the collaboration and the success of the whole group. I think it's really important. Like, if it's gonna work, that's awesome. And if everybody's invested and willing to put it into work to make it happen, that's fantastic. But I think a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, I participate in that, just to say that they're participating in it. And if they're not actually helping and digging in and contributing to the success of the goal, then sometimes it's better to say, you know what, we'd love to have you back in when you have the energy to participate or have the time or whatever. But right now, we really need people who are super invested or organizations who are super invested in the work we're doing right now, because that just builds resentment if you're like, okay, and then we're dragging these people, you know. So it's an interesting balance, I think, to kind of find that, but I feel like that with a lot of collaboration on like our side of stuff is very much like, okay, cool, if we're all in it, that's great. If we're not all in it, let's figure out a time later, like down the line, that we can join more people back together. But for now, we really need who's gonna be here in the room and making the work happen.
That's really great. So that kind of clarity around are you in or out? And the way you presented that was, really like judgment free. So it's not like you're a terrible entity if you're not in. It's like, okay, this isn't working for you. Like, let's just be clear about that. And then, but it may be an open door to come back in, which is obviously more possible for some collaboratives, less possible if you're talking about, committing multi-millions of dollars to shared infrastructure. Like, you can't really necessarily come back in and be like, oh yeah.
Get in now. Get in now. That's
Yeah.
It's the latecomer fee.
That's right.
Get a special question here.
That's great. Conversation. So maybe we'll move, I don't know, if someone else has something critical on collaboration. I don't want to cut anyone off, but we can.
What do you think of the word consensus conversation?
What do you think? Why are you asking that? I'll give you an answer, but I'm just curious, like, why are you asking that question, or what do you think about?
Well, I just am debating with some colleagues of mine, let's just say, and that word in particular, because consensus to me is, I don't love it that I can live with it. But it's being used as, the majority of us are on consensus, so we're gonna move forward this way. To me, that doesn't seem like consensus, that seems like direct democracy. And yet it would be better if we had consensus, in my opinion.
So one of the other tools that we do a lot of these conversant trainings, and I'm not a pitch man for them or anything, but they have some great tools online, and one of the things they talk about, which I think is what you're getting at, is like you have your, zone of preference and you have your zone of tolerance in a decision. And like that, like could be really like you're getting together with friends and you're like, where should we go out to eat? And you're like, well, I'd really love to have Thai food. And the group is like, no, we want to go out for Mexican. And you're like, okay, fine, we'll go out for Mexican. But like, if you are, allergic to raw fish and the group is like, no, we're going for sushi, you're like, I'm out, if it's sushi. So one of the tools that we'll sometimes use, like at the Nature Conservancy, like, just in a meeting is they'll do a little hokey, but all right. Like on a particular decision, are you thumbs up? This is what you like, you're in your zone of preference. Are you thumbs sideways? You don't love it, but you can live with it, or are you thumbs down? And, if everyone is like a stakeholder in the decision, you can't move forward when there's a thumbs down. You have to like listen to, so that's the knocking heads part. So, you have to listen to like, why is someone thumbs down? And, sort of move to like, kind of find something that could move their thumbs down to at least a thumbs sideways. Or if you set up a decision-making model that is not consensual, like the leader's gonna make a decision, the boss is gonna say where we're all, getting lunch from, then they need to acknowledge that they heard, well, but there's no gluten-free options, whatever. And they don't have to make that decision. Like they don't have to, make a decision that everyone is happy with, but that they are accountable to, sort of hearing that feedback and explaining, why, you might end up sort of a little bit out of someone's zone of tolerance. But if you're gonna say that you're in a consensus mode, that might be a way to think about it, like you were saying, is that, if someone is truly thumbs down and you've said you're in a consensus process, you really need to move everyone to zone of tolerance. But you might not get everyone to zone of preference, and maybe that's okay. That's okay. Equity. So what gets in the way of considering equity in decision-making? And what would make that easier, from wherever you're sitting?
An agreed definition of equity.
Yeah? A definition, right? What is it? Easy to say? And what is it in your context? Because maybe it's not, maybe it really is, maybe it's really like an ethnicity equity is what is most important and you're not thinking intergenerational. Or maybe you're really committed to intergenerational and you're not thinking of other, so I'd say, what is it? And, what are you might not be able to think of every dimension. So what are the dimensions that, you really care about? What else? What has helped you really bring equity into your conversations? And does this happen in like every session? Okay.
Also point out, just come over like.
That's, back like in Zoom days, I mean, we're still in Zoom days, but that's always how it was. You're like in a big meeting, you're about to hit unmute and then like right outside. Yeah. Okay, so what, sort of examples of like when you've been able to really bring equity in or what has gotten in your way with that. We had some great stories on collaboration. So some of you must have some equity, positive or negative stories.
I mean, just from our perspective, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, but when we go through these public processes, a lot of it's just practicality that gets in the way of equity. It's just not a reality for political folks, for residences, for how far dollars go, programs are, resources. There's a lot of good things to say, and maybe some of them make sense, some don't. So it just doesn't always work.
So what I'm, right, so kind of public process. So would that be an example of like, it'd be great to have 10 public meetings at different times of day and evening, fully translated childcare, food, and
Yeah.
yeah, and you can have one. Yeah. So that's kind of on the, if we go back to my equity definition, what I'm hearing you talk about is like that role in decision-making process. So like that in particular, that kind of decision-making role can feel limited by staff, staff time, resources, like all of that. Okay, thank you. That's helpful to surface. What about kind of other dimensions of, equity in terms of thinking about, who's benefiting, like who's winning and who's losing from decisions?
I have a really good one. Yeah, we have some folks in our community that have a louder voice than others just because of their privilege. And there's some areas within the city that don't have that loud voice. And that's what gets the attention. And so that's really challenging to see and kind of disappointing too.
Right.
And just insensitivities.
Yes,
Awareness.
exactly.
And these are mediums by which we collect feedback. So some of those mediums are not conducive to every walk of life, and so to expect somebody to attend a Zoom meeting at 7 p.m. when they have 5 kids that they're trying to feed and get to bed and everything, that's not, but sometimes that's the only opportunity we give people for comment. And so I mean, I found myself walking in Main Street, knocking on business doors, being like, can I talk to you for a minute? And then going back and reporting that I got feedback from the businesses and they, I was talking to them, they were like, how did you do that? We've been trying to do this for years. And I'm like, I just walked into the store and bought something. Yeah, but not every place is like that either. So you gotta really cater, how you collect feedback. I call it information extraction, like it's a science. You gotta figure out how to do it with every little project you do for every population that you need to focus on.
Meeting them where they're at.
Yeah. And in their language, which I'm not normally AI kind of freaks me out, but like I'm kind of excited because Google Translate. Yeah, so, and that's our only medium right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I was.
Don't put Google Translate stuff on there.
I was at Nature Conservancy, we just had a global freshwater summit, and it was in Mexico. And so people could present in English or Spanish, and there was, like real-time AI translation. I'm like reasonably fluent, I'm kind of fortunate enough to be like reasonably fluent in Spanish, so like some of the translation was really funny, because you're like, oh, that's way off. But like, it was like not bad. You could really see, and it was, real time, either you could listen to it or it was, like a transcript. But yeah, like miles ahead of where that was. So, as terrifying as many aspects of AI might be, there's, yeah, and I love your story about like just actually going out and, like you reaching out versus like waiting for the information to come to you. Like, where does that, it's kind of thinking about like, kind of where is the burden? It's like the burden of the information, as you were saying, kind of information extraction. Is it like the burden on the person to come to the meeting, or the burden on you to go out and, try to have that conversation? None of which is easy. Like, I'm not trying, I'm not like pointing fingers or suggesting that, any of this is simple, but I think it's just so helpful to kind of hear stories on, what has worked for folks. And okay, then I'll just tell like another little quick personal story just to brag a little bit. So, I have a 19-year-old who lives at home, and she was just hired by the City of Boulder to be a community connector for the disability community, which she is part of, for a new park that the City of Boulder is planning. So they had a Spanish language community connector and a Nepali language community connector, and they decided they wanted a disability connector. So she's been kind of reaching out to her whole network about like, what do people want to see in a park? And it's cool. And the city planners were like, oh, at a community meeting, we never thought about having like a little sensory table where, people can go and do that. So that's another kind of, which I didn't mention, kind of aspect of equity as well, is kind of the invisible and visible disability community. Okay, and then I feel like I go like, go too far over. So let's talk about, climate change or climate weirdness. This is what sometimes people like to call, or, variability, help what's happening to us. This is not, the climate greed is often really present. Like, gosh, like for people like who ski, and you're like, am I gonna ski with my kids? Am I gonna ski with my grandkids? Like, is there, there's gonna be snow. Okay, so my question here is, so do you think about climate change, weirdness, variability in your decision-making and planning? Do you feel you have the right tools to be able to kind of really help you with that and with thinking about resilience? And, if not, kind of what are some of the barriers? And CSU has lots of amazing tools in the.
We just had a climate group workshop.
Oh,
On Wednesday of last week.
yeah,
Or, yeah.
awesome. Yeah, so how do you, a lot of you are you're here because you're planners, really tough to plan into the unknown. What do you do with this?
We try and do it 40 years in the future. We try.
Okay, 40 years.
We call it your pie in the sky.
And where do you kind of get your information to kind of visualize like 40 years from now, what might be that range of water realities that we could be living in?
We do it with our code requires us to start with our planning commission, that's made up of volunteer residents of different walks of life. And in my town, there are just very little volunteers and people who work for a living. And so, the conversation I had with our last conversation, and you probably have very similar comments, is people didn't really realize until all the stuff in the news with the Colorado River, like it was a big conversation about water conservation. But for my town, it's more of can we add clover to our grass so we don't have to weed in water so much? Can we, and it was practical things that normal Jane and John Davis could do, just normal people could do, not what can the town do, these, great emphasis. They were thinking at the lowest level, kind of at their own kind of personal opportunities. So there's a lot of that in our comp plan. No forcing anybody to do anything, it's optional, but a lot of guidance.
Right, so kind of a way to help people visualize that, the way they could be using water could look different from, the way they were using water today, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
So one of the things, speaking of visualization, we're starting to do with our water efficiency person, and my GIS group is to start mapping out and looking at vegetation, so pervious surfaces, and just what's green, what's not, what does that look like, in our parks division and public works for their weed management. We're taking a snapshot of things right before they do it, when they do it, and then seeing what happens afterwards. And the whole pervious surface stuff is really important because we're starting to talk and think about something that Greeley does is water budget when it comes to the use. And our theme when we talk with our rates and when I talk with my billing folks is we need to save the water we already have. And so that's how we look at our data and that's how we look at our stuff. It's the GIS, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
I have a
Right.
They're such nerds.
But what that sounds like, what's really important, is that visualization aspect. So that people need to be able to kind of see, feel, smell, we're not quite at the like come to a public meeting, everyone gets their virtual reality goggles. That's.
On the flip side, we do the impervious surface too, when I'm talking about our rates and working on stormwater. Yes. And it's one of our most underfunded utilities. And so understanding how those change and being able to have that GIS data from year to, over a span of time, because that's tracking when people add additions to their homes, that impervious surface, which is easier to get that way than to like, let's search all of the information. And then that helps us understand, are we doing the right things too?
That's great. Yeah, so that kind of real time and, sort of ongoing information.
And I imagine getting into climate stuff, we'll look at it from a heat map type of way too.
Yeah. And having data that can kind of serve multiple purposes. That's great. And one or two others, and then we'll wrap up.
I think from small manufacturing perspective, it's not lack of information and lack of access to affordable options. So like people in beer and also other manufacturing and food and beverage are all aware of the fact that we need to conserve water and need to reuse water and need to make sure that the water that we put back into the system is good quality. But the smallest systems that you can install are, well, I just got another quote. It's only $800,000 now, you guys. It's so exciting.
But it's rather.
But it's the size of, we couldn't even if we could afford it, it wouldn't actually work for our facility because we don't make enough. And so the technology that exists is just too large for our industry right now. It's getting better, which is awesome, and hopefully, you know, the fact that I know that it's gonna take 20 years, the exact budget for that. But those types of things, I think, are, there's not financial repercussions when people don't choose to do the right thing often with regards to water in manufacturing, and so therefore they don't do the right thing because they're not being financially held responsible for that. And even when it is an easy fix that does fit your size, it's still something that you need to plan for financially, and you need to make sure that your team knows how to implement so that they're actually doing it correctly, and all of that takes time. And so some organizations are just like, it's easier to just do it the way we've been doing it. And so I think that's the biggest barrier from my perspective, is like, we know there's a problem and we're being as responsible as we can. And we know the technology exists. It's just so huge and so expensive that if we install, even if we did install one, it wouldn't process the amount of water we create because we only make 2,500 barrels of beer a year. Like, it's not a lot. And that's similar for a lot of other like small manufacturing organizations. And it was cool to hear from Wolverine on my experiments. But it's interesting, you know, like they have all of these recapturing methods and all that stuff, like those two giant things that he showed the picture of for heat recapture. Our heat recapture system is this big. It's a little box with a bunch of plates in it. Like, so there's those types of things, and we install those, and we're trying as much as we can whenever something fits our size, we make it happen. But that's the biggest barrier, I think, for us. It's not lack of awareness. It's like, grief is the right word for it, because you're like, I know that there's a problem. And so how do we implement solutions that actually make sense?
Right, so it's like the scale of the available solutions don't match the scale of your problem right now.
Yes.
Yeah. So
And yet the city has goals and they're a partner, and
Yeah.
they could contribute more and.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that for some of these things, truly, like, it would work for a brewery the size of Odell, which they have those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It would not work for any, like, Odell and New Belgium could utilize that type of technology, and they do. I want to be like, they're very proactive, but every other brewery in Fort Collins, and frankly, in northern Colorado, with like two maybe exceptions, other than those two, we're not big enough for those technologies to even work. And so just the scale of it is difficult.
Yeah, well, just, you know, even just by surfacing problems, because, you know, maybe some of you know some amazing inventors out there, you know, like hopefully kind of more solutions start to come online, you know, that match up those scales. Well, thank you all. As always, I feel like what I learn each time is I need to shrink back everything I say more and more, and leave more and more space for you all to learn from each other. And I love what I learned from all of you. And thank you so much for your time, and best of luck in all of your challenges. And enjoy the rest of your day. All right, well, we are now into our book club presentation.
Thanks, Diana.
Discussion.
So, we have a volunteer to go first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now everybody wants.
And short and sweet is how we like it.
Yes.
So.
You should read it.
So,
I forwarded it to you. so-
yes.
Okay.
And first group is YouTube. Great.
Yes, the band, you too.
Great. Band called the band too. So which one?
The band's here. Go. I'll go on this side. Yeah.
How many of these are?
I think there's 4. I know.
Oh, yeah.
Just don't skip to the last consideration for that.
Yeah.
We'll just do
Well,
this.
just again.
It's a repeat.
Okay.
I'm saying that.
Well, the one that
I
we
think
originally.
it'll be interesting, 'cause that is like.
I love it, see,
Yeah.
cool.
We'll see Kirsten, I'll just stay.
No, it's pretty simple stuff.
Want to use the clicker?
No.
No, okay.
Point.
Gotcha.
Teamwork.
Gotcha.
All right, so Michael and I did the Colorado water law for non-lawyers. I know that this has been presented before. Our other choice was a 600-page textbook. And no, that's a different thought. Oh my. All right, so just real quick, the synopsis, there's about 13 chapters. It's a good read. It really sets that stage with our climate and geology and hydrology. My favorite part was outlining the early water development and really this thought that this is the canvas on our human drama of water. This is where it starts, right? Expands that premise of, or explains the premise of the water law, our interstate and federal issues and disputes, and all the little things in between, non-tributary groundwater wells, and then administration and why. So it really provides a deeper dive and non-lawyer-ish speak that we really cover in this class. So it was really nice to kind of bring that together with what we've been doing already and actually present this at the end instead of in the book. So.
So some of the strengths, provides perspective into water for Colorado that was really never thought of, at least in my side before. I'm a dumb banker, so I came into this class with not a lot of knowledge. I mean, I knew about CBT and I knew about the pipes and I've seen all the things, but, really understanding that system that's been created and really the law system that's in place, to administer it, it's pretty amazing in how we kind of fell into it, and it's just evolved over time, and might not be the best system for some of these equality things that we're talking about, but it's the system that we're dealing with. So again, comprehensive view of how the systems work, and there was some really good storytelling of the history of the water laws. Like goes into a lot of detail, just how these things unfolded, and how we ended up in the position we are today.
All right, those challenges. It's a little dense and reads like a textbook, not big. But that's okay. I think that's to be expected with this type of information as we've kind of experienced this whole time. Very tedious to navigate if you're not, not in it to win it. And Absolutely. So, and then there's those challenging issues, that require specific levels of understanding, right? That's where if we didn't have maybe some of the premise before, like we've had, it would have been even harder. But it does feel like a Colorado water law.
Yeah. It gets pretty detailed, some of the examples and yeah, but it's interesting. It's just like, at times you're like, okay.
Like it goes in like this water case.
Yes, exactly. And they're great detail. And it can be interesting and helps you understand the process for some of these laws, but it's detailed.
It's not an audible book, that's for sure.
Yeah. Is it worth reading? I think we both agreed yes. And, I kind of had the idea or the thing that, would be a great prerequisite for this class to kind of give a basic understanding. Also, sitting here thinking it also would be an interesting kind of textbook for the class in some respects to be like, listen to the Prino talk and there's examples of change in use for industrial use and like what those people really have to go through. There's examples of that in this book and how it happens. I mean, and it's in quite good detail. So, it really offsets each other or complements each other, I should say. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, it's just the knowledge you gain, at least for somebody like me who maybe doesn't have exposure or didn't have exposure to it. It really gives good insight to some of the early conversations that we're having and some of the nuances. And these issues are great and complex, and this book is decent and complex. I'll say it gives you a good, pretty understanding of kind of, again, the where we are today. Doesn't offer a lot of solutions, but good context.
And as a person that has some knowledge in it, it reinforced some of those things, but it was additive too. That gave me an opportunity to go back to our community development director and our water resources manager and like, so. That's what you meant when you were trying to tell me to do that. That's what you meant. And it also helped me understand and how to explain in our communications too. So definitely, yes and yes, read it, hold on to it. Okay.
That is the last line. We found the last line.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's times like some days that it's like, okay.
Is yours verbal? Is yours verbal or is it an oral presentation or do I?
I sent it.
You sent it. I did get that. I did get that. I was like, looking through my, no, you definitely did. I remember now. I remember now.
We can just chat.
Yeah. The number of emails I'll send and then it'll close on me. If I close my email too fast, it goes straight to draft. And I don't realize until I reopen my email that it's in the draft folder instead of sent.
So we read this book, where the water.
There, you followed me.
Yeah.
So the basic gist of this very readable book is that it's kind of an overview of the whole Colorado River, from the headwaters all the way into Mexico. And the author follows the river all the way by land, not on a boat, which was an interesting exploration of the river, and a little bit by plane as well. He does some overflights at the headwaters.
Which was really cool. Just, that's how the book started. It was him in a plane and you're kind of like, oh, it's gonna be interesting. But yeah, so he interviews a bunch of different stakeholders, kind of throughout the entire process and throughout the journey. I appreciated that he talked to a ton of different people. So it wasn't just like, I only interviewed landowners and that was it, and that happened. He talked to community members, he talked to farmers, he talked to recreation people, like kind of tried to get as deep of a perspective as possible.
And he connected some of these very large scale issues to individual stories and made it very personable, readable, and relatable.
So yeah, so strengths wise, good introduction. I feel like everybody's kind of said that about their book, and I would agree with this one. Good introduction to the various issues that surround just talking about the Colorado River. And he didn't dive in just to legal, just to environmental, just to social. He really did a good job of talking to people that were involved in all three of those areas.
And as a very good journalist, he did spend a lot of time researching, it's very obvious, and puts in links throughout the book of where you could find additional information. So he doesn't dive really deep into any particular issue, but definitely gives you the resources if you're interested to follow that.
Yeah, and it wasn't just law, like I said, like it was enough of an overview that you were like, if I were more interested in the legalities behind this stuff, I could learn that from these sources. And kind of all the different people that he talked to with their own perspectives helped kind of move that narrative along.
Yeah, and I think we both thought that it was a very well-paced book. It's written by a journalist, which is obvious, and he really draws you into the story. So it makes it very readable, which it sounds like is the opposite of the last chapter. It was a quick read.
He was a journalist, and so some of the descriptions of the person who he was about to have a conversation with were longer than the conversation itself, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but occasionally we're like, okay, what do they think? Like, that's great. Like, it's so awesome that you like took a well-traveled path that was dirt to get to their home. That kind of was like a little bit flowery in that way, not in a bad way. But that did kind of break up some of the more like hardcore concepts. So it was nice, but it was a little bit like
All right, let's go.
And in that vein, sometimes it felt like he was taking twists and turns like a river does, but in the story, it was a little bit hard to link what he was talking about specifically to the larger storyline at times. But those were small challenges, I would say.
Yeah. So yes, we recommend this book. And yeah, like we said, good background, good overview, not too in-depth on any particular issue or area.
Very easy to read, engaging story, significant amount of content.
Yeah, and then it wrapped up really nicely about like what's next, which is kind of cool. And it didn't end in all doom and gloom, which I was a little bit nervous about at some points throughout. You're like, how's he gonna bring it back? And really, like the last chapter, I think was my favorite chapter, which is not typical, I think, for books that cover nonfiction in general, right? Like, so it was like a good kind of, we can do it, let's get together kind of thing, which is cool.
And then the last thing I would point out is that it's current, it was written in 2017, so although it's a little bit dated, overall, it feels like it's a pretty current read. So, yeah. Yes, actually, so one of the things I really liked about this was the, in 319, we talked quite a bit about this, and I felt like I got a much better understanding of what that was, so that.
Here's the council member of that. No, it was me, okay, gotcha. I'm not so sorry.
And.
Yes, and I'll donate mine too.
It's just like, I'm done.
Yeah, they did.
Throw in fear.
So are y'all presenting, no slideshow, right? No slideshow, right?
Mayor made from water.
There we go.
By Robert Krapathy.
Yes.
Next.
All right.
Norma? Yeah.
So next,
Yes.
you gotta do this part?
The book really chronicles the settlement of pioneers, who came to Colorado from the East Coast. Really focusing on the Boulder Valley. It really went through, I mean, talked a little bit about the caveman era and like how we might have used water back then, but focused a little bit on Native Americans, having that Spanish influence from the Spanish, the explorers, yeah, and then of course, the acequias, and how that sort of influenced the pioneer settling the Front Range. And, you know, realizing that this was the Great American Desert, of course, there was the need to move water around, using the acequia philosophy. We grew our ditch systems, and there cities started growing, and then we entered this modern era. It really tracked the development of, and if commodifying is a word, the commodifying of water. So it was really interesting, you know, when the settlers first started, you know, creating small communities, this was how the new law of prior appropriation started. Like, they really were socialist in their ideas, that they wanted water to be available for all people, not just the folks living right by the riparian or the river borders. So, you know, that's why we needed our ditches, to get water away from those rivers. And so that's how it started. But then with these ditch systems, corporations started to form, and then they turned into for-profit entities. And then they started charging exorbitant amounts of water or money for the water. So that's when, the governments were asked to start stepping in and they needed to really be involved to sort of limit what, those companies could be charging.
And then it also talks about just the change in the environment. The water system is dynamic in our part of the world, and so just naturally it changes, right? But then the miners came in and the trappers, and they changed the flow of the waters. And then the farmers came in and started digging ditches and canals, and they changed the riparian areas around the river and stuff. So nature has definitely, it's dynamic then, it's dynamic today. And humans have had a big part in the latter. Next. Now, this is Boulder. So, like I said, constant change. It did sort of romanticize the idea of the miner and the farmer and improving the land.
Yeah, I mean, like the first book that was talked about, what was it, the water law for non-lawyers? I mean, it did, like, this read like a history book. You know, really walked you through it. If you love history, I mean, you could just picture it in your mind, you know, a movie screen, and it really detailed, I mean, there was a whole chapter that detailed the process of digging a ditch. There was a whole chapter about the Sand Creek Massacre and like the fact that we took the land from the Native Americans. So, and which, like I knew about Sand Creek Massacre, but like I did not know the details of how it all happened. So super interesting. I love history, so I thought it was a strength of the book. You know, you talked about the last chapter being the most profound, and it was really just like, yeah, I mean, nature is always dynamic. Of course, we're part of nature, and we're going to change the landscape. And it didn't say in a bad or good way. It just kind of matter of fact about it. So it wasn't like biased one way or the other necessarily. And for me, I thought this was a strength of the book because, like, you know, for the first half of this session, of all of the months, I would leave class being like really frustrated, like how, you know, and this kind of gets to what you explained to me, Jennifer, like, how are we just not accepting of all of this change on the landscape? And, you know, having this perspective of that we've always like had a change on the landscape, even from, you know, the Native American days era, that just like put everything into perspective for me. And so, I'll get to it in a second, so you can go ahead. Challenges is like, yeah, like, if you like history, then all of the details that are in this book are really great for you. But, you know, I don't care where the people came from, I don't care when they were born, or like what their background is, like the fact that they changed the course of water law in Colorado, that's great. But I don't care if they came from, you know.
Yeah. And it was every person. And no, and many of the settlers in Colorado were Union soldiers, right? And they came out here and talking about the Sand Creek Massacre. Many of the founders of Boulder volunteered for Colonel Chivington's army, who were a part of the Sand Creek Massacre. And I didn't know that. You know, I know Greeley's history. It's utopian, the peace, love, and understanding. And to have Boulder founders be a part of the Sand Creek Massacre is just a very interesting fact that was brought up in this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more. Yeah, so would we recommend it? We both agreed that yes, we would. I've already started recommending it to people just because it did have, you know, the class in general. And then, you know, it just put the icing on the cake for me in terms of the environmental aspect of it. Just kind of set me on like an even balance, to, you know that, yeah, we're gonna have to develop things and we're just trying to make better choices. So, yeah. Yeah, great.
So I deleted your presentation. Verbal, oral presentation.
Play around with Pictionary.
Yeah.
So we had Colorado Water Plan, the 2023 update of the Colorado Water Plan, the easiest. Speaking of dry. The easiest way to frame this in my head is it's the closest thing Colorado has to a master plan for all things water. So for fun fact, this is the 20, you can go to the next one. This is the 23 version. What copy or edition of the water plan do you think this is? How many times do you think we've done this as a state?
Twice.
Twice. Well, you're all cheap, you know that. That was one of the things that blew me away. This didn't get started until 2015 as the first one, and it gets updated every 9 years. You would think in a state that's as water conscious as Colorado, every 9 years, yeah. They do a technical update 2 years after the water plan comes out, but the actual whole thing doesn't get updated for every 9 years. So it takes into factor all of these considerations, the climate change we've talked to, demands increasing. None of this is a surprise to anybody who's been sitting through this class at this point. But it also does some really in-depth modeling and basically takes a 30-year plan or 30-year view for all of Colorado's water needs. So. Next one.
Yep, that's fine. So some strengths. We thought it was great to see the overview. They go through an overview of the complexities of the system. They give you the statewide overview and then they go by each basin. And so that was a strength. You get to see kind of what the makeup is, the actions that are happening in each basin. You get to know who all the players are in each basin and how collaboration is occurring today. The whole back part of the plan is all the specific agency action areas, who the players are, what industries it's impacting, what goals it's impacting. So it's a good reference, I would say. Even if you don't read the whole thing, it's a great reference to be able to see what's going on in the state.
Some of the biggest challenges that it kind of talks about a little bit are stuff we've talked about, a lot of the different competing interests from the local municipalities, the different basins, robbing Peter to pay Paul, basically. It was very bold about calling by and dry an outright bad thing. Like there was no gray area there. It was just terrible. Don't do this, from a policy. It also called out, it definitely wants to have a lot more statewide collaboration. One of the recurring themes in the entire plan was this need for regional collaboration, overarching, to kind of eliminate this, everyone in their own silos pulling for their own interests and not considering the whole holistic picture. They started a DEI kind of component to the entire plan in that 2015 update. Which was interesting. They basically released the 2015 plan and then went, oh, wait, we forgot equity. We should include that too. So they have a formed equity task force to just look at the entire water plan through that lens, which I think is really great. Like I mentioned, it's only updated every 9 years. That feels really long to me. I mean, as we've talked about, it's such a dynamic system and things change so rapidly. It feels like, is it a biannual update? I don't know. We'll see how that happens. And frankly, just making it more accessible to read. It's insanely dry. No pun intended. It's 200 and almost 260 pages, which leads us into the next point, if you would please.
So we've talked about this. It's a good kind of reference point, but the executive summary also is much more accessible. So if you're looking to maybe get a feel for what the plan is, read the executive summary.
It's like 15 pages.
Yeah. There's also a lot of online resources linked to this. Just Google Colorado Water Plan. It gets you to that page and you can, play around with what information and detail you want. You don't have to read the entire thing.
Also, I started off reading the executive summary and then went and read the plan, and I don't feel like there was enough extra, it wasn't worth the extra 230 pages.
So,
Anyone else bring the?
The executive summary.
Yeah.
I did do that.
You get the gist.
Didn't it take them like 3 years to update it, like,
Yeah.
so it, that's very, that's a good amount of time.
Yeah, the legislature told them to start writing in 2012. It didn't come out until 2015, did an update in 16 or 17. And then they didn't touch it again until 23. And they're not planning on touching it again until 31.
yeah, and how you inspire collaboration if we're not, I mean, if the statewide conversation is every 9 years. I don't know how that gets people talking.
Right.
And
So
so
that
that,
goes back to my earlier.
yeah, that's why I was asking you those
Yeah.
questions this morning.
Yes.
Because I don't know how we are gonna collaborate if we're not, having this process happen more often. Sounds like you were really engaged when they were doing the water plan, but then you haven't attended those meetings
I've been
since.
here.
And so that's just really interesting to me after reading this in particular.
We mentioned like 9, that's crazy. I think we thought 5, every 5 years, you got a good shot to set that way.
Periodic updates. That's the
Especially
plan.
when it's a 30-year period.
Oh, I don't need another.
Yeah, so I haven't read the whole plan, but one of the things I found interesting is like, they really call out buy and dry as being bad, but then there's like no solution.
Yeah. It's a problem that all fire happens.
It's like, we need to support agriculture. So I'm trying to that, and it's like, the end. You're like, where's the rest?
How much interplay there's ever been with like the dual arm of things and thinking about population futures and the state demographer's office and everything. I don't know how, when we were having conversations about a statewide affordable housing needs assessment and trying to understand what future growth needs are, the two it basically was too difficult. And I've actually heard somebody here say that, a presenter here say that before, and I've heard it elsewhere too. Which, I mean, in my brain is like, okay, even more reason to figure it out. Because if it's the hardest problem and it's the crux of our future, duh. I mean, it's kind of common sense. So, but at the same time, we keep getting kind of stymied by political cycles that have different priorities. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, you can't, if we have unhoused issues and our children can't live in the house that we first bought and blah, blah, blah. Where does it end? When does somebody just kind of throw everything down on the table and be like, had it, let's figure it out? Because that hasn't happened yet. And I feel like these events, I mean, they're really great to have, to bring awareness to. But I find myself full circle coming back and being frustrated over and over again, because it's like, I'm a planner, we got a plan. Nobody's doing the plan. Nobody's working the plan, so.
One of the things I was a little disappointed about reading through it was I was going in hoping it would be more of a, like, this is the standard for the industry within Colorado, and this is how you define a water efficiency plan, or this is how you define a water supply rate or anything. And it's virtually none of that. It's documenting what different agencies and groups are doing, but there's no central resource for, here are the expectations, so we're all talking the same language across the entire state.
It's a water summary.
It's a summary, yeah, it's not silly.
Summary.
Yeah.
Putting it together and like into the action steps, like as a state, that's what's missing.
And I feel like that's a big barrier for collaboration, because how we factor, a water supply rate is completely different than how you do or you do, and we have to have that whole conversation of getting on the same page philosophically before we can even start to like agree how it really should be done and go from there. Like I said earlier, no common framework for a utility, how it should be structured or framed. It's totally different than municipality.
Okay, well,
Go ahead.
use. Announcements, so May 8th is our next, next week we're gonna be in May. May 8th will be our next class and our last class, but then the day afterwards, we have our field trip with NUSA from 12 to 3. I'm gonna try and get us some free samples, because it didn't happen last year.
If you haven't filled out the form to attend, please do and bring it over to me. I'm tracking. So if you don't know if you filled it out, you can come over to me and I'll let you know too.
Don't forget to send your summary of the water event to Ben 10. And doesn't need to be like 7 pages or anything, just short write-up of what you heard, what was interesting. And then our graduation ceremony is now scheduled, or whatever commencement, I don't know what you call it. May 22nd, 4:30 to 6:30. We got delicious food and free everything, alcohol, beverages. You can bring a +1. And we'll be getting an RSVP out hopefully next week. And, you know, want you to respond to that in the next couple weeks so we can get our numbers set at we'll have like a formal program that starts at like 5, a few speakers, and we'll give you a certificate. And it's really nice event, very pleasant out at the vineyard. So get on your calendars. I think Ben set a safe date. So yeah, I think that I don't have any upcoming water events on my calendar. I think we're in the clear until like the summer. So well, thanks, everyone. Enjoy your free 20 minutes.
Yes, no problem. I have extra forms too, if you need an extra form. Yeah, because you weren't.
I wasn't here.
Right. Yes.
Thank you.
That'd be nice to read this over, but I'll send you an email that says everything that's important, like don't bring jewelry.
Okay, I'll look at it.
Yeah.
You want that? Yeah.
If you can't, I mean. Yeah, and if you can't make it, you know, worst comes to worst, I just have to shoot anyway. It's the best to just have fun and reads.
Yeah.
They mostly just don't want to find jewelry in somebody's residential home in their yogurt. Yeah, unfortunately, you can't throw yogurt, you can't throw any jewelry in the yogurt.
Yeah, I
Yes. Just the list of all the things, and I'll send an email that says all the stuff. You just have to feel it. Yeah, you can just fill it out and send it all back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's gonna be really cool.
Yeah.
There are some calves at the end if people like to pet calves. I did that last year. Okay, I can ask them, I can, yeah, like it won't come off, I believe that, I'll ask real quick. I recall that that's happened in the past and they were cool with it, like wedding dance and things. Thank you. Yeah, I recall that they were okay with that. The worst that would happen is they give you a glove. That's the worst that would happen. They just be like, here's a glove, please. No, that's the worst that they would ask you. Sorry, you can't come to the. Yes, yep, all good. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, totally. Yeah, have a good one. Thanks.
Yes. They decide every year what they do in municipal. Essentially, what amount of water is.
Thanks. See you next month.
And let's say, it's really well.
See you next month.
But in the afternoons, how they try to do like, you know, more lunch and something, like dedicated carriers. That's not also a problem, I don't know if that problem as well.
And then like almost getting kind of.
Yes.
Bigger places. I know, when I looked at it initially, I was like, okay, so we're gonna go from municipalities to like private, like conservation recreation, but then it's gonna go right into like oil and gas and then like the variety is just unbelievable.
Especially that the federal government is like
Yeah.
It's like I'm gonna do this.
Right.
Okay,
That's what we're saying.
I'm not even.
Yes, so let me take it.
The historic issues that we fixed.
I will, I got that. Let me take it. Oh, you're right.
Have a good one. Yeah, no problem. See you next month.
Yeah, take care.
Yeah, you got it. That's definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to room and tell me if we'll let you know.
It's like space.
Right. I'm looking at your budget.
Catering. I have these two.
Right, it's grown too much. They're bored.